This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click a big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We're counting on you. This episode is sponsored by the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. It's part of our continuing series on democracy, populism, and authoritarian trends in the region, around the world, and elsewhere. We're determined to get to the bottom of it.
But we haven't really done that much exploration of the issue of populism in the Middle East. And to that end, we've invited Professor Dani Filc. He is a man with an unusual biography. He's a professor at the Department of Politics and Government, Gurion University. Proper disclosure, I used to teach there. I have great affection for that department. He began his career with an MD from the University of Buenos Aires in his native Argentina, and after moving to Israel, he practiced as a doctor for 20 years. Then did his PhD from Tel Aviv University at the Kahn Institute for History and Philosophy of Science and Ideas. Dani has researched and published widely on issues such as healthcare policy, neoliberalism, my personal favorite, comics and politics. And he's on the board of Physicians for Human Rights in Israel and the newish Arab-Jewish social movement called Standing Together. Most importantly for us for this episode, he's written extensively on populism in general in many places in the world and comparative research, and including in the Middle East. And we'll be discussing his various articles, including political radicalization in Israel, populism in the Middle East, other works in Hebrew from recent years. Professor Dani Filc, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. Before we get down into the weeds of how populism plays out in Israel and the Middle East, I want to start with what we all love, theory. So much has been written about populism, and every article starts by trying to redefine this rather somewhat elusive phenomenon. How does your definition differ from all other definitions, or which definitions do you adopt, and then what do you add to them?
Well, I would think that it's more the second part of your comment. It's not that I have created a new definition. I think more about adapting existing definitions. I would say that populist movements are movements that emerge in societies in times where there is a conflict on the inclusion/exclusion of certain social groups, and populist movements can play a role, or usually play a role, in the inclusion or exclusion of those groups. Populist movements have what Kasmude calls a thin ideology, which consists mainly in two topics. The first one is considering society as divided into two rivaling forces, or two rivaling camps. One is the people, which is considered as pure as the one who has the truth, who represents the truth, and the elites, the evil elites. So this confrontation between the people and the elites is part of the populist conception. The second main topic is that they have a non-liberal conception of democracy, where democracy is understood mostly as the unmediated expression of the will of the people, and less as a set of procedures or individual rights. So in that sense, in the tension between democracy and liberalism, while liberal philosophers, as for example Isaiah Berlin, prefer, or mutatis mutandis, Farid Zakaria prefer the liberal, and populists prefer the democratic end, even if that means sacrificing some of the liberal procedures or liberal rights.
Tell us about what you have described as an inclusive versus exclusive populism within that, because I think that informs a lot of your, analysis of specific cases.
Yes, I would say that the two concepts or the two perspectives that I try to add is the idea of the people can be defined either as the whole political community, the nation, or as the plebs, as against the aristocracy or the common people, Amcha in Hebrew, as against the elites, and as an ethno-national unity, what the Germans call Volk. So different populist movements will, while the first definition is common to all, inclusive populist movements emphasize the idea of the people as the plebs, while exclusionary populist movements emphasize the idea of the people as an ethno-cultural closed unity. So while inclusive populist movements are a way by which excluded social groups become part of the common we, like we also are the people, exclusionary populism reinforces the identity or the privileges of certain groups by saying we are the people, you are not. So that would be the difference in it.
Dani, the Argentinian political theorist Ernesto Laclau features prominently in your analysis. Can you take us through the broad themes of his contribution and explain why you found it so central to your understanding of the concept?
Okay. There are two moments of Laclau's approach to populism. The first one when he was still a Marxist, but a kind of sui generis Marxist, and he spoke about the people as that group that it's interpolated as not being part of the powers that be. In his 2005 work on the people, what he argued is that different social groups put forward claims, and that those claims can be addressed separately, and he called that the democratic approach, where each group's claims are taken into account or answered or given some kind of response by the government, but sometimes the government or the powers that be are not able to address separately each claim. And then what he says is that there is a kind of chain of what he calls a chain of equivalences, where different claims are put together into a common claim, and the common claim is constituted of the groups that belong to that chain of equivalences appear as the people. One example in Israeli terms could be the social protests in 2011, whether we can have different claims, the cottage, the price of housing, education, health, and when the feeling was that the government isn't able to cope separately with each of those claims, then all those claims were integrated into what was the protest main slogan, the people needs social justice. So that, in a way, I think that Laclau's theory is very useful to understand the conformation of the people as a political process and not as something which is, a natural or historical or biological, but as a result of a political process.
And I think it's also useful in understanding the prevalence of populism, why it's just everywhere all the time and refuses to go away and comes back in all sorts of iterations because of its agility, because of its ability to transform. I was thinking a bit like, maybe a biological metaphor here, and, thankfully you're a doctor, that it's like, it's a bit like an enzyme, taking apart plenty of protein molecules and creating new ones and putting them together and taking apart others. This kind of this constant creation of new forms of populism that just adjusts itself to different arenas.
But I want to sort of link to that question and say, if that's the case, let's say Gilad's approach is correct, does that mean that any society has the elements that make it vulnerable to populist movements? Or are there some societies that are particularly vulnerable? And I mean, if it's a biological process like the human body, any society at any time or at specific times could be vulnerable to those movements. What do you think?
Well, Margaret Canavan, who has also studied both the concept of the people and populism, she has a very interesting claim. She says that populism is like the shadow of democracy because democracy, there is a kind of unfulfilled promise in democracy, that it's the idea that the people are sovereign, the people are a self-governing entity. And what she argues is that, at least in liberal democracy and representative democracies, that promise is never completely fulfilled, and that populism aims to fill the gap between the actual way in which democracies work, what she calls the pragmatic aspect of democracy, and the promise that democracy carries with it is the idea that the people can govern itself unmediatedly. So in this sense, populism is possible in every democratic society, not in a non-democratic society. And populism, I think that the chances that you'll see a populist movement emerge increase insofar as the citizens feel that representative institutions do not work as they should.
Right.
Which also accounts for your background. I mean, we can all hear your accent. I'm sorry, but also
I said in the biography.
yeah, but also Ernesto Laclau, who's Argentinian. We had Cristobal Kaltwasser on, who's Chilean. We had him on a few months ago. Why is it really that draws so much interest from people from Latin America? So it is in many ways a Latin American phenomenon.
Well, it's interestingly, it's very, very identified with Latin America because it is true that populism is a kind of spectre that haunts Latin America for years. And I must say, and it should, I think it's important to say it because of the forum we're speaking. I don't think that populism is always a negative phenomenon. As Canavan says, and for sure as Laclau says, I think that exclusionary populist movements are for sure very problematic because they have, even though they speak in terms of democracy, the fact that they aim to exclude certain groups is clearly anti-democratic. But inclusive populist movements usually become the way in which previously excluded groups can find some kind of partial inclusion.
That's very interesting, I have to say, Dani, because when I was reading your work, I would say for the first time, after doing a long series about this issue last year as well, I started to think, some elements of this are valuable. And I don't think your work is written in a biased way, but I think that we so often approach populism with such intensive normative judgment. Is that because it is so often identified with right-wing nationalism? And the way you describe exclusive populism, it's very overlapping with nationalism. I mean, would you say that a more left-oriented populism often of the kind that has manifested in Latin America, has, some corrections to other kinds of governing systems?
And do you see any chance of inclusive populism making any substantial gains? Or maybe give us an example where it has? Because you did mention the 2011 social protests in Israel. And one thing you can say about it is been almost a complete and utter failure.
But he has a longer analysis of inclusive populism, and it's more historic. And maybe this is our segue after we've piled on these questions. Our segue to talking about Likud of the 1970s, which you analyze as an example of inclusive populism.
I would say that I don't want so much to speak about left and right populism, but more than of inclusive and exclusionary populism.
Fair enough.
Because the concepts of left and right are also polysemic, so it could, and I think the idea of inclusion and exclusion is clearer. The inclusive populism is the way in which excluded social groups can gain some kind of partial inclusion by becoming an active subject from a process of reification, which usually was built on clientelist ways of inclusion. They are recognized as a legitimate political subject. I think inclusion is partial in two ways. It's partial because usually populist movements do not put an end to the structural causes of exclusion, or at least not wholly put an end to that. And inclusion is partial also because, differently from liberalism or socialism, where claims are universal, populism makes more local claims, like we are part of the people. We have the right to be included because we also are part of the people. But speaking in terms of the people, also always it's a claim that has boundaries.
Right. There's always somebody who's not. And also, wouldn't you say that even in inclusive populism, what the two forms seem to share is a tendency towards consolidation of power in the hands of a new elite that undercuts minority rights, for example, and liberal democratic checks and balances, which in a way, doesn't that kind of maintain the partial aspect of inclusion?
Yes, but I think that you are addressing liberalism on its face value, because
for once,
every liberal democracy that I know, it's built on a minority in power and a very, very unequal distribution of power and resources. So
True.
The liberal discourse is universal, but the liberal practice is far from being inclusive and egalitarian. So I would think that in that sense, once again, populism, with its stress on self-government, with its condemnation of the way in which elites are in power and hold power as against the common people, in that sense, populism can have a democratic role and play a democratic role. And it's true, my personal biography, the fact that I come from Latin America, where at least in the 50s and 60s, populism was clearly inclusive, it influences the ways in which I see populism, and it's different than the ways in which Europeans see populism, because in Europe, especially since the 90s, populism has been mainly exclusionary. There has been some attempts to build a kind of different populism for a certain period. Syriza has been considered as, by authors like Stavrakakis, which was a disciple from Laclau, as a case of left or inclusive populism. In a way, Inigo Errejón, who was the number 2 in Podemos for a while, tried to do the same with Podemos, and in that sense, the crisis between Pablo Iglesias and Errejón, I think, happened because of the differences between Iglesias, who wanted a more classical kind of left movement, or left to the social democracy political movement. And Errejón, who was also very much influenced by Laclau, thought about a real populist movement, but both Podemos and Syriza were short-term experiences in that sense. And it is true that in Europe, populism has been mostly exclusionary, and in that sense, it's damaging for democracy. But that should be said, at least from my point of view, without the idealization of liberalism and with the full understanding that liberal democracy is in many cases the reason for the emergence of a radical right populism.
I think we agree. Let's try to move eastward. Tell us about Israel. You have, historic cases. You look at populism starting from the 1970s and through to the present.
Yeah, you're right that in Israel there are three major populist movements, Shas, Israel Beitenu, and of course Likud, which is the standard bearer of Israeli populism in your analysis. Can you take us through the manifestations of populism within these movements and really about the differences between them and how they play out?
Okay, I think that under Menachem Begin's leadership, Likud became an inclusive populist movement in the late 50s, 60s, 70s. As I said, its inclusion was partial. It was a way for the partial inclusion of Mizrahim. It left Israeli Palestinians outside, but we should be honest and say that Israeli Palestinians were also left behind by the Mapai hegemony. So it wasn't. So in terms of Israeli society, the role of Likud under Begin was inclusive, even though it was not inclusive of all social groups. With Begin's resignation, Likud undergoes a period of transition. And at least in its beginnings, Benjamin Netanyahu, when was elected, his vision was of Likud as a neocon party, very much in the frame of the Republican Party in the Reagan and post-Reagan era, having all the characteristics of neoconservatism. But I think that the neocon alternative failed, and the very bad elections, very bad performance of Likud in the 2006 elections, the worst since Likud was created in 1973, brought Netanyahu, who is a very shrewd politician, to understand that in many ways the neocon alternative is not useful in the Israeli situation, and then he led the transformation of Likud into a radical right exclusionary party. Now, the first expression of radical right populism in Israel is Israel Beitenu under Lieberman's leadership, and I think it's a way symbolic the fact that for a very, very short period, Likud and Israel Beitenu went together to elections, and in a way, you can say that the success of the populist exclusionary way in Israel was the personal failure of Lieberman, because Likud became what he wanted to create, and Likud was a bigger party with a much bigger constituency. So Lieberman, in a way, was left without margin to continue the exclusionary populist way. So he's trying to reinvent himself and his party once and again.
I want to jump in just on that point with Lieberman, because I think it's very important. I'm very frustrated by the fact that many people don't seem to realize that the undermining of the judiciary in Israel, which is part of this kind of populist approach, let's say, to governance in this phase in Israel, did not start under Netanyahu, but you actually cite at many points Lieberman Avigdor Lieberman in the mid-2000s already, 2006-07, I think you have statements of his talking about how to limit the power of the Supreme Court. And in a way, it seems like he had this ideology. So I agree with you.
He also had criminal cases at that.
And he had criminal cases at this point, sure. But he was kind of advancing this vision along with the justice minister at the time who was pushing back on judicial activism, but also that there might have been another kind of more strategic political reason for Likud adopting that, and that's that in 2009, Lieberman won 15 seats. And most of those seats above, beyond the traditional older former Soviet immigrants came from Likud. Could it be that Netanyahu simply said, he's taking my votes. I want to do what he's doing and do it better?
Yeah, sure. I think that through Lieberman, Netanyahu understood the potential in the radical right populist way. Now, I think that the judiciary and judiciary review, I must say that I'm not a fan of judiciary review, and there is a huge literature criticizing judiciary review of legislation by people who are not populist. Jeremy Waldron, for example, who is clearly a liberal thinker, he has written an extraordinary piece on the problems of judiciary review. And in Israel, I very much recommend Manny Mautner's last book, and he shows how the changes between what he calls the first generation of Supreme Court judges and the second generation of Supreme Court judges, and how the anti-democratic elements that are part of judiciary review in a way can become as excuses or as kind of, they feed these radical right populist arguments against the elites, against what Lieberman called the oligarchy. And yes, Netanyahu made it better, and he clearly and he clearly led his party to adopt all the characteristics of a radical right populist party. What I would argue, and this is part of my current research, it's still in the making, is that you can't stay 10 years in government only by working on the symbolic level. And this is one of the claims I make about populism, that populism works in three different levels, both at the inclusionary, in its inclusionary aspects and its inclusionary ones. It works at the symbolic level, it works at the political level, and it works at the material or distributional level. For example, welfare chauvinism is one of the elements of exclusionary populism.
Okay, but what did you mean when you said he can't continue to win or stay in power for 10 years just on the symbolic level? What was the symbolic level that you meant?
The symbolic level is this chain of equivalences that Netanyahu builds, and he builds a chain of equivalences which is a negative one. It's not the positive chain of equivalences we spoke about when discussing Laclau, but he builds a chain of equivalences to show who are the enemies of the people. And his chain of equivalences goes like that. ISIS is like Iran is like Hezbollah is like Hamas is like the Palestinian Authority is like the Palestinian Israeli citizens, and the Palestinian Israeli citizens are like the leftist traitors that support.
I totally agree with you. I always said that the advertisement that he made in the 2015 elections, which was a 14-second spot, showing exactly that chain, showing left-wingers kind of becoming ISIS members, won him the elections. That is his chain of equivalence. It was such a clear, he took just what you said, put it into a 14-second spot, and he won the election.
And in Israel, after the failure of the Oslo process, and after the the problematic consequences of the Arab Spring, that kind of chain of equivalences can be felt like reflecting certain aspects of reality. It's not felt like completely crazy.
Right.
But I think that's the symbolic level. But I think that he couldn't have succeeded to remain in power for 10 years if it was not also grounded in economic policies that can at least maintain the social bloc that supports him in a way united. And I think that in that sense, what happened to him after he was Ministry of Finance in Sharon's government is very clear. He was
in the mid-2000s.
Unpopular Ministry of Finance, and I think that is very much linked to the fact that Likud, under his leadership in 2006, get only 12 seats in the Knesset. But if you check what happened from 2009 to 2019, you can see that there are characteristics of the growth model in Israel and specific policies that allowed for better conditions for the lower middle and middle Mizrahi classes who are the core of his support. And you can see that the Gini index went down. And you
somewhat.
can see that in the last 7-8 years, there was a 38% increase in the minimum wage, and that the median wage increased significantly. And and you can see that private consumption in Israel grew more than private consumption, the average private consumption in the OECD countries. So there is also a set of policies, also due to the advantages of the Israeli growth model. I don't think that we'll have the time here to analyze that, but that provide a kind of economic ground for the symbolic elements to work in the long run.
Okay, Dani, I'd like to ask you to now focus perhaps on the third example of Israeli populism that we haven't really looked at, which is Shas, and that might be a segue to discussing religious populism in the other arenas in the Middle East that you've also written about, namely Iran's Khomeinism and Erdogan in Turkey. The interesting thing about religious populism is that it has inherently has this element of elitism in it that is in many ways anathema to populism. Can you explain how that plays out?
Well, yes, it's true. And in fact, for example, in Iran, you can see that within Khomeinism, you have two clear currents. One that stresses the elitist elements, where the religious leaders are the source of truth, and other one, and everything is top down, and a more populist current, which is related to the centrality of the Ummah, and in a way, Ahmadinejad in Iran represented this more populist current, and that brings different interpretations of religion. The same you can say about Shas in Israel. In a way, all the work of Ovadia Yosef was presented as a much more popular way of addressing religion than the Lithuanian understanding of religion.
Lithuanian ultra-Orthodox, you mean, yeah.
Yes, within the ultra-Orthodox, but many of Shas leadership were educated in Lithuanian yeshivot, and Ovadia Yosef, but they took that and they transformed into a much more into a kind of dialogue between the religious leadership and the masses.
And the socioeconomic marginalization of that community. They
For
fuse
sure.
that. Tell us how that played out in Turkey. I think one of the most unusual things you've done here is compare Israeli populism, religious populism, Turkey and Iran. So maybe we can bring that together. And then I'm curious to know what that means about populism in the Arab Middle East. But let's start with maybe just a quick wrap up of Turkey. And we don't have that much time left, but what can you tell us?
So in Turkey, what happened is that it was a lot of neoliberal reforms, privatization of finance, but it also gave people working in the informal sector. In Turkey, there were a lot of people working in the informal sector. It provided them, for example, with health insurance that they didn't have before. It opened the certain sectors of the economy to groups which were relatively strong, but were not part of the economic elites linked to the to the traditional elites in Turkey. So it had, at least in its beginnings, an inclusionary element. Even it was, in terms of, for example, of the relationship to the Kurdish, in its beginnings, Erdogan was much more open to some kind of dialogue with the Kurdish leadership than his predecessors. But what happened in Turkey is that within government there was an authoritarian turn of populism, and what we can say, I don't think we'll have the time, that what you can say about populism is that when government, it's much more easily degenerates into a kind of authoritarian expression of populism. And I think that is related to the idea that the people is homogeneous.
Yeah,
Either you define it as the plebs, or as if you defined it as the folk. There is a kind of fantasy of the people being a homogeneous and a unity, and this implies the danger of anti-pluralism.
Right. I mean, this is why I want to try to wrap everything, all the different examples up by asking you. It seems like in many of these cases, the populist movement, the original Likud populist movement in Israel, the version in Turkey, even in Iran, and even some historic examples that you mentioned in your work, such as Huey Long, the very controversial governor of Louisiana. These people made genuine economic and social improvements for poor people, but it seems like it becomes a devil's bargain that invariably it seems to lead, if not stopped, it seems to lead towards consolidation of power, the wreckage of procedural democracy, destruction of any sort of democratic, or let's say liberal democratic protections, despite the danger of elitism on that side. Is that
or even exclusionary populism?
Or exclusionary populism
it's
turns
something
into
that
that.
starts as inclusionary
Right.
populism, at some point transforms into.
Is that an
exclusionary
inevitable trade-off? And if so, is it still, is populism still in a way a correction to what you point out is the exclusionary elitism of liberal democracy? So can we ever find a way out?
Well,
if you answer this question, I will vote for you for prime minister.
No, for me, there is a way out, but it's not that I would say as a political activist and not as a researcher.
Fine,
Yes,
tell us.
I think that in a way, I'm a socialist. I think that in many ways, socialism, democratic socialism, can be a kind of way out because it aims to deepen democracy further than liberal democracy, and it has not the authoritarian risks of, well, it had historically. That's the reason I'm speaking about democratic socialism. But seriously, it's true that there are a lot of perils in the populist alternative. But once again, I think that there is a tendency to focus on the anti-democratic characteristics of populism and being quite blind to the anti-democratic characteristics of liberal democracy in a neoliberal globalized era.
That's a very good summary.
Yeah. Okay, Professor Dani Filc, thank you very much for joining us
Thank you
today.
for healing the inevitable disease of democracy.
Yeah, or at least giving us some food for thought about that. And also many thanks to Itai Shalem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and once again to the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for sponsoring the series, and to the Van Leer Institute for their general support. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews. And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. And do not forget to follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.